In the closing months of World War II, the German military found itself in a catastrophic situation that led to the unprecedented surrender of roughly 500,000 soldiers to the advancing American forces. By early 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing under the weight of relentless Allied offensives from both the Western and Eastern fronts. The German army, once regarded as a highly disciplined and formidable force, was now demoralized, severely weakened, and increasingly fragmented. Supply lines had been cut, transportation networks were in ruins, and key cities and military installations were under constant aerial bombardment, leaving German troops stranded without sufficient food, ammunition, or medical supplies. The cumulative effect of years of brutal warfare, coupled with strategic miscalculations by the Nazi leadership, created conditions in which soldiers were confronted with stark choices: continue fighting in hopeless circumstances, face annihilation, or surrender to Western forces in the hope of more humane treatment. Intelligence reports from the time highlight that German soldiers often calculated the likely outcomes of encountering different Allied forces, concluding that surrendering to the Americans offered a significantly higher chance of survival than continuing a futile defense against overwhelming odds. The psychological dimension of surrender played a critical role in this mass capitulation. German soldiers had been indoctrinated for years with propaganda portraying the Allies as brutal and merciless, particularly the Soviets, whose treatment of prisoners was widely feared due to accounts of reprisals and harsh conditions in captivity. By contrast, American forces were seen as more lenient, organized, and capable of providing relatively humane treatment to prisoners of war. This perception was reinforced by first-hand accounts from earlier surrenders, interactions with civilians fleeing the Eastern Front, and intercepted communications that highlighted the strict adherence of American forces to the Geneva Conventions. Moreover, the morale within German units had been eroded by repeated defeats, the constant threat of Allied air raids, and the chaotic retreat across the Western European theater. Many soldiers, exhausted by years of combat and aware of the inevitability of defeat, made a pragmatic choice to surrender to the Americans, believing that this would maximize their chances of survival and eventual repatriation. This decision, while practical, also reflected a profound sense of disillusionment with the Nazi leadership, whose propaganda had promised victories that never materialized and ignored the increasingly dire conditions faced by ordinary soldiers. Strategically, the Allied advance in 1945 created a context in which mass surrender was almost inevitable. By March and April of that year, American and British forces had penetrated deep into Germany, crossing the Rhine River, and cutting off large concentrations of German troops from their command structures. Cities such as Cologne, Aachen, and eventually Nuremberg and Munich became focal points of intense combat, yet German forces found themselves increasingly outmaneuvered, encircled, and deprived of any meaningful logistical support. The Wehrmacht's operational capacity had been decimated by months of relentless bombing campaigns, including the destruction of rail networks, fuel depots, and critical industrial centers. As the Americans pressed forward with coordinated infantry and armored units, German soldiers faced the stark reality of encirclement with little hope of relief from their own command. In many cases, surrendering to the Americans became a tactical decision. Troops could avoid senseless casualties, secure shelter, and receive medical attention. The scale of these surrenders, encompassing entire divisions and thousands of individual soldiers, reflects both the overwhelming power of the Allied offensive and the recognition by German units that further resistance was strategically futile. These mass capitulations were not isolated incidents but occurred across multiple theaters of the Western Front, highlighting a systemic collapse of German military organization as the Allies closed in on Berlin. The human dimension of this surrender is also critical to understanding why 500,000 soldiers chose this path rather than fight to the last man. Families of German soldiers, whether in the homeland or in occupied territories, had endured years of suffering, displacement, and deprivation due to prolonged warfare. Letters, diaries, and oral histories from the period frequently reveal that soldiers considered the welfare of their families when deciding whether to continue fighting or surrender. The prospect of capture by the Americans, who were perceived to maintain discipline and provide food and medical care, offered a glimmer of hope that they could survive the war and return home to their loved ones. Additionally, the Nazi leadership's insistence on fanatical resistance, exemplified by Hitler's last-ditch orders for no surrender, had lost credibility among troops who had witnessed the futility of such directives firsthand. The collapse of German morale, the recognition of American military efficiency and humanity, and the sheer impossibility of continuing effective resistance combined to produce one of the largest single surrender events in modern military history. The surrender of 500,000 German soldiers in 1945 not only marked the impending end of the Third Reich but also underscored the human instinct to survive, the pragmatic assessment of military realities. Relentless Allied advance, the mass surrender of 1945 became not just a military event but a profound humanitarian phenomenon that revealed the psychological collapse of a nation at war. When the first major groups of German troops began laying down their arms before the Americans, scenes unfolded across the countryside that symbolized the total disintegration of what had once been one of the most disciplined armies in history. Entire regiments marched toward American positions, waving makeshift white flags made from bed sheets, shirts, or scraps of cloth. Many soldiers carried wounded comrades on improvised stretchers, others clutched what little remained of their rations. Some approached American lines in silence, their expressions hollow and lifeless, while others sobbed openly, overwhelmed by exhaustion, fear, and relief. The Americans, though initially cautious, quickly adapted to handling such massive influxes of prisoners. They established temporary collection points known as cages, where German soldiers were disarmed, registered, and given food and medical care. For many of these men, it was the first proper meal and medical attention they had received in weeks or even months. American soldiers were struck by the sheer number of Germans surrendering voluntarily, often without direct orders from their officers, a clear indication of how thoroughly morale had collapsed within the Wehrmacht. Behind this flood of surrenders lay deep disillusionment with Hitler's leadership. The Führer's speeches, once electrifying and commanding loyalty, now rang hollow as the promised miracle weapons failed to appear and the Allies marched unopposed through once secured German territory. The infamous Nero Decree, in which Hitler ordered the destruction of Germany's own infrastructure to deny it to the enemy, was met with disbelief and quiet defiance by many officers. They could see that the war was lost and viewed continued resistance as senseless slaughter. Many mid- and lower-ranking officers began quietly encouraging their men to surrender rather than die for an ideology that had brought only ruin. This internal breakdown of command created chaotic but widespread capitulations, especially in the West where American forces were advancing rapidly and offering comparatively humane treatment. Reports from the field described entire battalions laying down their weapons after receiving leaflets from American aircraft promising fair treatment under the Geneva Convention. Psychological warfare units dropped millions of these leaflets, assuring German soldiers that surrender was not dishonor but survival. For men who had seen their comrades killed in hopeless battles, the message resonated deeply. They no longer believed in Hitler's final victory, they believed only in staying alive long enough to see the war end. By late April 1945, the number of prisoners had become so overwhelming that American supply chains were strained to the limit. Field kitchens, medical tents, and transport convoys were redirected to accommodate the hundreds of thousands of surrendering Germans. In some areas, particularly in the Rhineland, local farmers and civilians were recruited to help distribute food or assist in registering prisoners. Yet, despite the logistical chaos, the treatment of prisoners remained largely disciplined. The U.S. Army had strict orders regarding the humane treatment of POWs, and violations were rare compared to the brutality of the Eastern Front. For German soldiers accustomed to the horror stories of Soviet captivity, where death rates among POWs were extraordinarily high, the reality of American camps was almost surreal. They received regular meals, medical care, and the opportunity to write home. Although conditions were crowded and uncomfortable, most prisoners recognized that they had escaped a far worse fate. The fear of being captured by the Soviets had been one of the strongest motivations for surrendering to the Americans. Soldiers who fought near Berlin or the Oder front desperately tried to flee westward, often abandoning their posts, deserting their units, and walking hundreds of kilometers through bombed-out towns just to reach the American lines. The phenomenon was so widespread that it effectively accelerated Germany's military collapse, as entire sectors of the front disintegrated when troops chose surrender over resistance. In the eyes of many Americans, these surrendering Germans represented both a logistical nightmare and a moral responsibility. The Allied commanders understood that the manner in which they treated these prisoners would have long-term implications for post-war reconstruction and the image of democratic civilization. The contrast between American treatment of POWs and the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime against millions of civilians and prisoners was stark. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, insisted that discipline be maintained and that no revenge or humiliation be inflicted upon captives. American soldiers, many of whom had witnessed the horrors of liberated concentration camps, struggled with their emotions but largely followed orders. Eisenhower introduced a new classification known as disarmed enemy forces, rather than formal POWs, a designation meant to reflect that these men were not ordinary prisoners but remnants of a defeated enemy force. Even so, the Americans ensured basic humanitarian standards were met. Field reports describe how chaplains visited prisoner enclosures to conduct services, and medical officers vaccinated the wounded and sick. For many German soldiers, this humane treatment came as a shock. It contradicted years of propaganda that had painted the Americans as barbaric or cruel. It also planted early seeds of respect that would later help pave the way for reconciliation between the United States and West Germany. However, the massive wave of surrenders also exposed the moral decay within the Nazi hierarchy. As frontline soldiers chose to lay down their arms, die-hard Nazi officials continued issuing delusional orders for total resistance. In towns and villages, fanatical party members, often members of the Hitler Youth or the Volkssturm militia, tried to enforce Hitler's fight to the last commands, executing anyone suspected of cowardice or defeatism. Yet even these brutal tactics could not stem the tide. The Wehrmacht was exhausted, its generals demoralized, and its communications in disarray. When word spread that American columns were approaching, entire communities began organizing peaceful surrenders, sometimes sending delegations of priests or local elders carrying white flags to negotiate with advancing troops. In southern Germany and Bavaria, where many civilians hoped to avoid Soviet occupation, American soldiers were greeted almost as liberators rather than conquerors. These surrenders were not just acts of military capitulation, they were the collective decision of a population desperate to survive. The distinction between soldiers and civilians blurred, as both groups understood that continuing the war served no purpose except prolonging suffering. This pragmatic realism contrasted sharply with the suicidal fanaticism displayed in Berlin, where Hitler's last loyalists were fighting hopeless battles in the rubble of the capital. The American forces, for their part, were astonished by the scale of the collapse. Military historians later noted that never before in modern warfare had such a large and disciplined army surrendered so completely in such a short time. In less than 6 weeks, more than 500,000 German troops gave up their weapons in the Western Theater alone. This enormous influx of prisoners forced the U.S. Army to establish massive temporary holding areas, including the sprawling Rheinweisenlager camps along the Rhine River. Stretching across open fields and surrounded by barbed wire, these camps held hundreds of thousands of men under guard. Conditions were basic, often harsh due to shortages of food and shelter, but there was no deliberate cruelty. The American military struggled to feed so many people at once, as their primary logistical focus was still on combat operations and humanitarian relief for liberated civilians. Despite the challenges, mortality rates among these prisoners remained far lower than on the Eastern Front. For many Germans, the mere fact that they were alive, despite defeat, was itself a kind of miracle. Some later recalled feeling gratitude mixed with shame, gratitude for survival, shame for the crimes committed in their name by the Nazi regime. The surrender also carried immense political consequences. It marked the definitive end of Hitler's thousand-year Reich, reducing it to rubble within 12 years of its creation. When news of the mass capitulations reached Berlin, Hitler reacted with rage and disbelief, accusing his generals of treachery. His delusional orders for counterattacks went unheeded, communication with the front lines had broken down completely. In reality, most officers ignored these commands, focusing instead on negotiating surrender terms or leading their men to safety. The chaos that engulfed Germany in April and May 1945 was unprecedented. Bridges were destroyed, railways bombed, and communication lines severed. Amid this disintegration, surrendering to the Americans was the only rational act left for many soldiers. In the days following Hitler's suicide on April 30, the last remnants of organized resistance in the West evaporated. German Army Group B, under Field Marshal Walter Model, had already dissolved. Model himself refused to surrender and committed suicide. His troops, left leaderless, walked into American captivity en masse. Similar scenes played out across southern Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia as word spread that the war was over. When General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender on May 7, 1945, it was merely the formal acknowledgement of a reality that had already unfolded on the ground. The German army was finished, and its soldiers had chosen life over death. In the months following the surrender, the captured soldiers became silent witnesses to the rebuilding of Europe. The Americans, now responsible for feeding millions of civilians and prisoners, worked with the Red Cross and other agencies to stabilize the situation. Many of the surrendered Germans were put to work in non-combat roles, repairing roads, clearing debris, or assisting in reconstruction. These tasks, though forced, provided a sense of purpose and dignity to men who had lost everything. For many, it was the first step toward a long process of reckoning. They began to hear about the atrocities committed in concentration camps, the mass graves, and the extermination of millions of innocent people. The initial disbelief soon gave way to a grim awareness that they had fought for a regime responsible for unimaginable crimes. This realization deepened their gratitude toward their captors, who treated them humanely despite the horrors their nation had unleashed. Historians later noted that this humane treatment helped lay the foundation for post-war reconciliation and the integration of West. In retrospect, the surrender of 500,000 German soldiers to American forces in 1945 stands as one of the defining moments of the 20th century, a moment when human survival instinct triumphed over blind ideology. It symbolized the collapse of a militaristic system built on deception, fear, and fanaticism. The soldiers who laid down their arms were not heroes in the traditional sense, but their act of surrender represented a collective rejection of madness. They chose life, even in defeat, over meaningless sacrifice. The Americans, by responding with discipline and humanity, demonstrated the power of moral restraint even in victory. Together, these two forces, the desperate surrender of the vanquished and the measured conduct of the victors, shaped the post-war moral landscape of Europe. The scenes of German soldiers marching into captivity, weary but alive, remain among the most haunting images of 1945. They remind the world that in war, the line between survival and destruction often depends not on weapons or ideology, but on the simple human decision to lay down one's arms. In the months and years that followed the mass surrender of 1945, the legacy of those 500,000 German soldiers who chose to yield rather than die came to represent a deeper transformation in both personal and national consciousness. For the men themselves, captivity in American hands was an experience filled with contradictions, humiliation and relief, uncertainty and hope. They had lost their homeland, their cause, and the army that had defined their identity, yet they had gained something far more fundamental: survival. Many of them found themselves in sprawling prisoner-of-war camps across Germany, France, and even as far as the United States. At first, these camps were overcrowded, as the Allied forces struggled to process the sheer number of captives. In the early summer of 1945, open fields surrounded by barbed wire became temporary homes to thousands of defeated soldiers. The men slept under the open sky, fashioned makeshift shelters from branches and blankets, and stood in long lines for rations. Yet even in these austere conditions, there was a pervasive sense of relief. The thunder of artillery had ceased, the bombing raids were over, death no longer stalked them every hour of the day. For many, captivity was not punishment, it was salvation. Letters smuggled out of the camps reflected this sentiment. "I am alive," one soldier wrote to his family, "and for that alone I am grateful. The Americans feed us, they do not beat us. I think often of home, but I think more of how I am still breathing. The process of demilitarization was swift and absolute. The Americans confiscated weapons, uniforms, and insignia. Officers were separated from enlisted men, and Nazi Party members were identified for questioning. Propaganda slogans, once shouted with pride, were now whispered with embarrassment or erased entirely. Within the camps, hierarchies collapsed. The rank of general held little meaning when everyone was equally powerless behind wire fences. For the first time, German soldiers experienced a level of equality that their own regime had denied them. They shared food, blankets, and stories, bound together not by ideology but by survival. American guards, some barely older than the prisoners, maintained order with efficiency but also curiosity. Many were astonished at how young and ordinary their captives appeared. These were not the fanatical supermen of Nazi propaganda but weary, hungry men, farmers, students, mechanics, who looked more like victims of war than villains. The Americans began organizing educational programs, sports, and even lectures to occupy the prisoners' time. Some Germans, especially officers and educated men, were asked to assist in cataloging records or teaching English. Through these small acts of engagement, the psychological distance between victor and vanquished began to shrink. The war had created monsters, but captivity slowly reintroduced humanity. By late 1945, as the full extent of Nazi atrocities came to light through the Nuremberg trials and newsreel footage of concentration camps, many of the surrendered soldiers faced a devastating moral reckoning. For years, they had believed, or chosen to believe, that they were fighting to defend their country against external threats. Now they were confronted with the horrific truth of what their government had done in their name. Photographs of skeletal prisoners, mass graves, and destroyed towns were circulated even inside the camps. American officers made sure the German POWs understood why their war had been fought in vain. The initial reaction was disbelief. It cannot be true, many said. But as evidence piled up, silence replaced denial. Some broke down and wept. Others turned inward, struggling to reconcile their loyalty as soldiers with the atrocities of their leaders. This moral collapse was perhaps the most profound defeat of all. The surrender had taken their weapons, but the truth now disarmed their souls. Over time, conversations among prisoners shifted from anger toward introspection. What were we fighting for, became the haunting question that echoed across barbed wire fences. For many, there was no clear answer. They had been pawns in a vast machinery of lies, and now, in captivity, they were left to piece together what it meant to be German in a world that viewed them with suspicion and shame. Yet even within this moral twilight, the seeds of reconstruction were being sown. The Americans recognized that Germany's future would depend not on perpetual punishment but on transformation. In 1946, many former POWs began to be released or transferred to labor units under Allied supervision. They helped rebuild bridges, clear rubble, and restore electricity to devastated cities. In doing so, they contributed to the very recovery of the nation they had once defended in war. The paradox was striking. The men who had fought for Hitler were now rebuilding a democratic Germany under the watchful eyes of their former enemies. This pragmatic approach, turning captives into collaborators in reconstruction, proved to be one of the most effective post-war policies of the 20th century. It prevented chaos, reduced resentment, and gave millions of men a purpose. Over time, many POWs who had been held in the West developed genuine respect for the Americans. They compared their treatment to the horrors reported by comrades who had fallen into Soviet hands and realized how differently the war might have ended for them. The humane policies of the Western Allies thus laid the groundwork for a stable post-war Europe, built not on vengeance but on pragmatic cooperation. Meanwhile, the psychological scars of surrender persisted. Many returning soldiers found themselves estranged from their families and communities. Their uniforms were gone, their honor questioned, their futures uncertain. Germany itself was divided and occupied, its cities reduced to ashes, its moral compass shattered. The men who came back from American captivity were often more reflective, more skeptical, and less easily swayed by ideology. They had seen the consequences of blind obedience and war fanaticism. Some joined political movements that later shaped the democratic institutions of West Germany. Others chose silence, preferring to bury their memories. Still, their experiences in captivity left a lasting imprint on German society. Historians have often argued that this period of surrender and reflection helped pave the way for Germany's eventual moral renewal. It forced a generation of men to confront the cost of their nation's delusions and to rebuild not just their cities but their conscience. They had learned that true strength lay not in conquest, but in the courage to accept defeat and change. On the American side, the experience of handling such a vast number of prisoners also left its mark. Soldiers and officers who had participated in the administration of POW camps came away with a more nuanced understanding of the enemy. They realized that the German soldier was not a monolithic figure of evil but a human being caught in the machinery of dictatorship and war. This perspective later influenced U.S. policies during the occupation of Germany. Rather than treating the entire population as guilty, the Americans differentiated between hardened Nazis and ordinary citizens. This pragmatic compassion became the cornerstone of the Marshall Plan and the rebuilding of Western Europe. The same soldiers who had once faced German fire were now distributing food aid, organizing elections, and helping re-establish local governments. The transition from war to peace was not instantaneous, but it was guided by a belief that lasting victory required moral as well as military triumph. The surrender of 500,000 German soldiers had demonstrated that the enemy could be defeated without annihilation. Now the Americans aimed to show that former enemies could also be redeemed. The memory of those final days of surrender continued to haunt Europe for decades. Every spring, as the anniversaries of VE Day and Germany's capitulation were commemorated, veterans recalled the surreal calm that followed the chaos. Many remembered the moment they laid down their rifles, how heavy they felt, how final the gesture was. Some spoke of the strange silence that settled over the battlefields once the shooting stopped. It was as if the world exhaled, one veteran later said. That silence marked the end of an era of destruction and the beginning of a long, painful rebirth. For the 500,000 men who surrendered to the Americans, it was the moment they ceased to be soldiers and became simply human again. Their choice to surrender rather than fight to the death had not been an act of cowardice, but of reason. It preserved lives that would later contribute to rebuilding a shattered continent. Their surrender symbolized not defeat alone but also the first fragile gesture toward peace. As post-war Germany evolved into a democratic and prosperous nation, the stigma once attached to surrender slowly faded. Historians began to reinterpret those events not as a disgrace, but as a pivotal turning point in moral courage. The act of surrender, once considered shameful under Nazi ideology, came to be seen as the first step in reclaiming humanity. Schools, museums, and documentaries later explored this transformation, highlighting how ordinary soldiers helped turn the page on one of history's darkest chapters. Some of the former prisoners went on to write memoirs, recounting their experiences in American camps and their reflections on the futility of war. These writings became valuable historical documents, offering first-hand insights into the psychological journey from indoctrination to awakening. They spoke of hunger and fear, but also of unexpected kindness from American guards who shared cigarettes, food, or simply conversation. In these moments of humanity, the cold machinery of war gave way to the warmth of understanding. The memories of surrender, captivity, and survival became intertwined with the broader story of Europe's recovery. Looking back today, historians regard the surrender of 500,000 German soldiers to the Americans as one of the most extraordinary humanitarian episodes of World War II. It represented the collapse of an empire built on violence and deception, and the emergence of a new global order based on cooperation and accountability. It also underscored a timeless truth, that even in the darkest moments of history, human beings retain the capacity to choose life over destruction. The soldiers who surrendered in 1945 could not have known what kind of world would follow, but their decision helped make that world possible. Their act of surrender allowed the war to end sooner, saving countless lives on both sides. In the years that followed, the United States and Germany, once mortal enemies,